I'm a little pumped up, if you would, because Tennessee beat Alabama last night, so if the little Baptist-costal comes out of me, I'm just apologizing ahead of time. It's been since I was in high school since that happened. So that was exciting. But I'm so excited to be here with you guys this morning. This is my favorite day of the week, coming together, worshiping with you, growing in faith together. Excited about this topic of rebuilding what is broken through the study and journey of Nehemiah. And as we've been going through this study together, I've been thinking about it from a different lens. And I don't know if it's just what I do for a career or if it's just the stage of life that I'm in, but I'm thinking about this story through the lens of family ministry, of how to empower our families, how to reach our community, about the brokenness around us. And so this morning, we're going to go backwards a little bit before we go forwards, but hang with me because there's something here for all of us this morning as we journey together. And you can open your Bibles up to Nehemiah because that's where we'll obviously be this morning. As you guys know, the town of Jerusalem was in ruins. It's kind of the setting of the scene in the 5th century BC, and there's this struggle of faith and an unprecedented future. And one of two things must have been true if you were living in this town in this time. One being you saw the ruins and the destruction around you, and you just got used to it, and you didn't even notice it anymore. Or secondly, you saw the brokenness and the mess around you for generations, and you just thought these problems were too big to solve. That there's nothing that could do to make this better or heal what was broken. And if you think about it that way, we all can fall into that camp sometimes, can't we? We can look at the community around us. We can see the brokenness around us, the hurt, the things that people are struggling with, the thing our cities are struggling with. And we can think to ourselves, these are just too big of problems for us. And we can stop imagining. We can stop dreaming about how God could actually use us and use this place to fix the brokenness outside of these gates. And so that's what's happening here in Jerusalem in the 5th century BC. That's the setting of the book of Nehemiah. That's what's happening. And on the front end, there's multiple layers to this story, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning. But as they came together to rebuild the wall, that's kind of one thing that happened, was we learned that we can do more together, right? But there's something really critical in that, and this is what I want to hang my hat on this morning. If you're taking notes, it's this: when we do something together, it has the potential to affect how a whole generation sees who God is. You see, church, there was a generation sitting in ancient Jerusalem, looking at this broken down walls, looking at this mess, thinking about what God had promised them, and this isn't the reality they're living in. They're seeing this brokenness, and I imagine that someone who works with teenagers, you had a teenager, a 13-year-old, saying, I'm a little skeptical about this faith that you have, mom and dad and grandparents. And, I hear these stories of old, stories like, Joshua playing the trumpet and winning the battle of Jericho, and Moses raising the staff and splitting the Red Sea, and David taking a little stone and destroying this giant. And I think, why can't that same God solve the brokenness and problems in our community? I mean, mom and dad, why do we stop talking about the issues that we see around us and actually start doing something about it? As someone who works with teenagers, I could imagine of a student or a kid living in that time, saying, hey, I think I'm done with this. I'm not going to go to temple this Saturday, and that Passover thing, I think I'm done with that. And my pet lamb chops, you remember that one? Yeah, we're not going to sacrifice him anymore, right? I want to keep him around. And I think that's why this story, this book of Nehemiah is so important, because just like in Nehemiah's time, church, we could have a generation who's watching how we live out our faith, watching us live out the things we say we believe, and maybe they're doubting, maybe they're struggling with their faith. Are we really living it out the way we say we believe? And I think that's where this book can come in to play. If Nehemiah was anything, he was a doer, wasn't he? He got things done. And, our generation is in desperate need of some Nehemiahs. Some people who are willing to get some things done, to use their corner of influence for the glory of God. So this morning, we're going to learn some lessons from Nehemiah. And we're going to go back to chapter 1. And like I said, we're going to go farther. So don't fall asleep on me just yet, okay? But the first one is this: name what's broken. We have to be willing to name what's broken. I think Pastor Mike said this, an honest assessment, but Nehemiah's story begins where he's living like his everyday life, like we do. We get in our routines, and then bam, he gets smacked with some news, doesn't he? That his hometown is broken. The gates are shattered. And in fact, let's go ahead and remind ourselves of that in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 3. Those who survive the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and his gates have been burned with fire. The town was in ruins. And even more importantly, the gates and the wall had been broken down. And when Nehemiah heard this, he thought about his people, and he mourned, just like you would do when you hear something bad about people that you love. He mourned, but he instantly went to God, didn't he? He fasted and he prayed. And we're going to talk more about how that moved him to action in a moment. But first, I want you to think about what that mourning process is actually showing us. It's this. If we can't name the problems, then we can't really be a part of the solutions. We can't name the problems of what's going on in the world around us and what's going on in our families and what's going on in our lives, then we can't be a part of the solution. And I think sometimes we just have to assess the reality of what's going on. I mean, Nehemiah, he became aware that his hometown was in shambles. His people were hurting, and this wasn't just a physical thing. This was a spiritual attack as well. Their future existence was at stake. And then Nehemiah prayed to God because he recognized that the current reality that his people are living in, this is not the one that God had promised them. And I think every once in a while it's good for us, church, as we get in these rhythms and routines, kind of like Nehemiah was, and then he gets faced with the wake-up call. It's important for us every once in a while to have a wake-up call because it's easy for us to ignore and walk by the brokenness in the community around us and the brokenness even right here within these walls and just ignore it. We can get so focused and laser locked in on what we're doing every day that we don't even think about how God could actually use us to make some change. And as we're in our routines, often we'll get that text message, won't we? We'll get that news report of something disturbing that happens in our community. And it's really what we do with that information that determines our character, doesn't it? You know, do we ignore it? Do we just say that's the way things are? Do we even pray about what's going on? Or do we get involved? And so this morning, church, I want to say we need a wake-up call, right? We all need it, myself included. We can get so focused on our routines. Now, Nehemiah, he didn't ignore what was going on. He went straight to the Lord. Now, he didn't excuse what his people had done, but he also didn't wait for God to do a miracle. Have you caught that part of the story? Look, same chapter, verse number 4. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for a number of days, fasting and praying before the God of the heavens. And I said, Lord, the God of the heavens, the great and all-inspiring God who keeps his gracious covenant with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your eyes be open and your ears be attentive to hear your servant's prayer that I now pray to you both day and night for your servant, the Israelites. I confess the sins we have committed against you, both I and my father's family have sinned. He didn't just wait for a miracle. He mourned, yes, but he didn't sit in the sadness. He moved into action, and he's almost like he's in a panic in this. If you can kind of catch the vibe of this prayer, he's like, God, my people are in trouble. I'm going to do something about it, and I need your help, Lord. I need you to make a way, because here I'm going. He moved quickly. Why? Because his people had a potential threat, both to their physical and spiritual needs. It's interesting what Nehemiah says at the end of the first chapter. After he had the report of the bad news, after he prayed about it and fasted and mourned, he made this statement at the end that says this, I was cupbearer to the king. And in that statement, he's telling us a few things. First, he's telling us who he's not. You know, Nehemiah wasn't like a spiritual leader or a priest. His only job was to keep the king like healthy and happy, you know, and I want you to not miss this morning, church. Your responsibility to the people in this room, to the people in this community, has nothing to do with your profession. Church, we're responsible for engaging this lost and broken world, not because it's our job description, but because we're the people of God, right? And we are the church. We are the ambassadors of the Son of the living God. We represent Jesus who came to humankind and he died so that others may know who God is, and we're supposed to follow what he did. That's what we are to do. And with this statement, I was cupbearer to the king, Nehemiah is also implying something else. Not just that he's not a preacher, but also that he has some privileges that he can leverage to help those who are broken And church, sometimes we have to leverage whatever we have. Why? Because people are worth it, right? We have to leverage our status, our influence, our resources, our privileges, our knowledge, our finances at times. We have been called to leverage whatever we have to reach this world around us who's in desperate need. There is brokenness around us, church. Not because we're just trying to be good people, but because we are God's people, right? When I read the phrase, I was cupbearer to the king, I think of so many people in this room, so many people in other churches that I've served at. You know, churches where people were lawyers and they were serving in the preschool ministry. Had a truck driver serving in 7th grade boys. And I think, man, they get it. They know their profession has nothing to do with their responsibility to the people around them. And I know this church is filled with people who know that. And I'm excited to serve with you as we move forward. But we have to be willing to leverage what we have for the sake of the next generation. When Nehemiah heard this news, he not only leveraged what he had, but did you catch this part? He risked everything. To bring such a request to the king, he could have been killed. He could have been exiled. He could have lost his job. He could have been thrown in prison. But that's not what happened. He risked his privilege, his position, his power. Why? Because people are worth it. People are worth it. Church, we can't expect to restore or rebuild anything unless we understand that it has the potential to cost us something. It's going to cost us something, and I hope we're honest with this. I hope we all want every preschooler to have like a really good start in their faith. I hope we want to see kids who are in the foster system get out and find loving families. I hope we want to see teenagers have consistent, caring adults who will point them to Jesus. I hope we all want to see the poverty and brokenness in our cities just be healed. I know we want to see the broken things restored, but oftentimes we want to see that stuff without it costing us anything personally. When someone else is doing the work, right? But what we really need, church, are some Nehemiahs. People who are willing to get in the dirt and do something to rebuild what is broken around us. Look at Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 4. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 4. The king asked me, so what's your request? Immediately he went to God. I prayed to God, the heavens of the heavens, and answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servants have found favor in you, then send me to Judah, to the city where my ancestors are buried, so that I might rebuild it. So Nehemiah did something really important here. He not only leveraged his position, he not only risked everything, but he actually left his comfort zone to do something about the need. He wanted to see the situation up close and personal. In a very practical way, he was ready to roll up his sleeves to see the change that needed to happen for the betterment of his people. And if you want to be the kind of person who understands what's really going on in your community within the families that God has already given us here, then you have to be someone who's willing to go and see for yourself. And sometimes, church, we got to encourage each other to get on the front lines. If you don't go see for yourself what's really going on in the lives of the kids and students and their families and our neighbors and our neighborhoods, then we'll never be able to help people and engage with people the way that God really wants us to. Look with me in verse 11, same chapter. After I arrived in Jerusalem and had been there 3 days, I got up at night and took a few men with me. I didn't tell anyone what my God had laid on my heart to do for Jerusalem. The only animal I took was the one I was riding. See, church, Nehemiah had to go to Jerusalem. He had to see the brokenness up close and personal for himself. He had to be in a place where he could dialogue with the leaders and get a full picture of what's going on before he could actually lead them to do anything in real change. You know why? Because proximity will always change your perspective. The closer you get, the better you can see, for most of us at least, right? And when you have enough courage to go see for yourself, then this has the ability to change your perspective and the way you think and the way you talk and the way you feel about the community around you. And the more of us that's willing to get closer to the brokenness that's around us, the more impact we will have, not only on this church property, but outside these walls. Imagine if enough of us in this room really got close enough and got out of the comfort zone and went for it. If enough of us would get close enough to parents who have special needs or people of a different race or color or a different political background or whatever the difference may be, what if we got close enough that it actually bothered us enough to want to do something about it? We should, church, never measure our success by the amount of people that are here, but by how willing we are to get into each other's lives and push each other to grow in our faith, right? See, some of you might wonder, how do I do that? How do I start showing up for people? How do I make real change in my community? And since I have the microphone and I'm the family pastor, then I get the opportunity to say, I think for a lot of you it means showing up in the lives of our kids and our students and their parents and even their grandparents that God's already given us. I think one thing we can do as a church is give every kid an adult who will show them who Jesus is, right? See, our community, I've done mission trips here for several years before I was over here. And I've been to the worst parts of the community, been to the best parts. And I'm telling you, our kids are experiencing brokenness at every level, from home life to their neighborhoods to their schools. There's brokenness on every corner. And from my perspective, I think about this story about the kids who are sitting in that brokenness. And I think about the kids in our own community who are experiencing the same thing. And I want us as a church to think that this place, this church, is the best opportunity that the kids in this community have to meet Jesus from a consistent, caring adult. You know, the best way we can really start rebuilding what's broken is by the families in here strengthening in their faith and growing in their faith and developing that. And then we want to, as a church, be able to recruit volunteers to develop adults who can show up in the lives of our next generation. Because the more of adults that get close to the kids and their families, the more impact we will not only make here in these walls, but outside of these walls. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But church, there is no substitute. There's no substitute in a kid's life for a consistent leader who will point them to Jesus. There's a generation sitting in the wings, watching every person in this room. Watching how you respond to trials, watching how you respond to the news channel, watching how you respond to the brokenness around you, and they're making their determination of who God is oftentimes by how we respond to those things. Are we really serving the God that we say we do? Because, church, we have a generation that we might lose if we're not willing to get close enough. See, Nehemiah is teaching us about a lot of different things in here, but one of the things he really kind of leans into is expectations. I love this part of the story. When the wall's being rebuilt, did you ever think about the fact that everyone was expected to participate in the rebuilding of the wall? It's not like they went outside and hired construction workers to come in and build it and architects to think it through. No, it was everyone who was already in the community. The same people who were in the community in the shambles for generations are the same ones who rebuild it. And I love Nehemiah's visionary speech. You know, as a pastor, you're always looking about how to say things in a creative way that might catch your ear or whatever. And Nehemiah was just blunt, and that's how you know God's done something, right? Listen to what he says, chapter 2, verse 17. You guys see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem's in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. How about we rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so we're not a disgrace anymore? I mean, what a speech, right? And then the people replied, verse 18, sure, let's build this thing and begin working. Think about it. It's an interesting group of people. You have perfume makers, jewelers, designers, preachers, politicians, merchants, and of course the cupbearer, who are now all working as construction workers. You know, there's a lot of people doing something that they weren't very good at doing, that they were not experts in doing. And sometimes, church, we have to do something that we just don't know how to do. And I love this story because so many people just jumped in and did what needed to be done. And I'm not saying anything bad about this, but you know, it wasn't like they passed out a spiritual gift thing. It wasn't like I said, hey, I'm going to pray for it for 5 weeks. They just jumped in and started doing stuff they didn't know how to do and trusting that God would teach them and praying to him along the way. Why did they do that? Because people were in danger. There was evil at the gate. There was an enemy coming after their families. In church, we have an enemy. There's something coming after every kid and family here, and I promise you, it's even crazier than it has been in a long time with this technology boom. It's tough. We have a real and present danger coming for our kids. And Nehemiah, he looked at them. He never told them it would be easy. But at the end of the day, he was inviting them to do something bigger than himself, something that only God could do if they worked together. And church, I'm going to tell you what we're doing here, what God's calling this church to is not going to just be easy. But we're also not going to ask you to do less. We want you to do more. We want you to grow in your walks with the Lord, grow in your relationships with your families, teaching them the things of God, serving. We want you to do more. Why? Because there's an enemy. There's a need. There's a community that's lost, that needs the hope that we have. See, everyone that Nehemiah needed to rebuild the town was already in the town. They already lived in the community. And like I said, some of those same people that sat in that mess for generations were the same people that finally, with God's direction, rebuilt the wall. And the people we need to live out the plan that God has for this church are already here in this room. Why? Because you're here. You're here. Maybe some of you have never considered the idea that God wants to use you in that way, to do something bigger for his glory, to rebuild what was broken. But we want you to start imagining what could happen in the hearts of this next generation as if we were to work together and do what God has called this church to do. Now, there's another group in this story that you would think would be obvious that we don't want to leave out, and that's the parents. See, just at the right time, there was enemy heckling them. The morale was low. They thought maybe this wasn't going to work out. And just at the right time, Nehemiah got the parents involved. Look at Nehemiah chapter 4, verse number 13. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your who? Families, your sons, your daughters, your wives, your homes. It's like Braveheart kind of moment, right? The emotion of this moment would have been unimaginable. Everybody knew that the enemy was planning to attack. Everybody knew what was at stake, and so Nehemiah did something brilliant. He posted families in the openings in the walls, and they stood there, and you know what happened? When he reminded them what they were fighting for, when he positioned them in the right spot, the enemy didn't attack. When the families stood in the gap, put their faith to the test, the enemy did not attack. And when he rallied these families, these parents, it was a game changer in the whole story of Nehemiah. In this one moment, he changed the whole thing. Here's the point. If we can craft our vision of it as a church in a way to inspire every mom and dad and guardian and grandparent to understand what's really at stake for the future of our kids, it would not only change the momentum of this church, it would change how a whole community sees us. And Nehemiah, he's fighting for something bigger. He's not just fighting for a building project. He's fighting for a whole generation's concept of who God is. One thing that he does brilliantly is he connects the condition of the town to the condition of the people's faith. I think oftentimes we don't do that. We like to blame other things. We like to blame all the external things in life for the brokenness around us. But if we were truly living out our faith, it would be so attractive that people would want to see what we have and want to be a part of it. So don't miss what he's doing in this moment. He's leveraging the concern of his kids about their future to position them as champions for their children's faith. Now, don't take it wrong. God's the hero of the story here. But what is going on is God's giving them an opportunity as parents to live out their faith in such a way that they see who God is, but now their kids are seeing them live it out, and they're able to look at their moms and dads and imagine what God might do through them one day. Many of them had never seen God move this way. And Nehemiah, he was fighting for a whole generation's concept of who God was. Church, we can't change how people see our church unless we're willing to change how we see them, right? It's a spiritual battle going on. It's not flesh and blood. We want this place to look like somewhere that makes parents and families win. a place where they can come for hope. And I'm telling you, this generation is hungry for a church that really prioritizes people in it. He set the example for us, Nehemiah did. Although all this negative energy was coming at him, all this reasons to give up and quit, he kept working together. And in 52 days, they rebuilt this wall. And they did so with the astonishment of the skeptics who were outside of the wall saying, this will never happen, this will never happen. They did so with the amazement of the people who had sat in the brokenness for years thinking there was no hope. And now they've come together to do this miraculous thing, but they also did so at the wonderment of a generation watching God move through their parents and their friends and families. Some of them had never experienced God in this way and what God could do through them. So I want you to not miss this. God didn't show up in an obvious miracle in the story. He showed up through the hearts of the people, through the lives of the people, and it changed not only the way the people inside the walls knew who God was, it changed the outside. Let me close with these three things to prove that point. Number one, those outside the walls, the skeptics, changed what they believed about God. In chapter 6, verse 16, read with me. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized this work had been done by the help of God. The people outside, the ones who said this will never happen, who were threatening them and heckling them, said this won't happen. When they saw it happen, they knew it had nothing to do with those people. It was by God. It changed how a whole community saw what was going on in church. If we live out our lives in such a way that we're chasing God's plan for our lives and for this church, the people out there will notice. It starts with us, strengthening our faith in our families, in our homes. Look at number 2. Those inside the walls changed how they listened to God. Look at chapter 8, verse 3. He read it aloud from daybreak till noon as he faced the square before the water gate in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of law. So let's be honest. That's like a really long Sunday school class and not the most exciting book to read from, right? But it says they listened attentively. Why? Because a move of God had happened and now they're hungry. They're hungry to grow and to learn more. And when you really experience God, it changes things. Number 3. A whole generation changed how they worshiped God. Same chapter, verse 17. From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated like this. Their joy was great. It changed the inside of the church. When they saw God move in such a way, it stirred a new faith within them. I wonder if Nehemiah knows the impact he had on generations to come. I often wonder that. I want us to hang our hat back on this same verse that I said at the beginning. How we work together can change how a whole generation sees God. As so true, church. When kids see us coming together for the purpose that God has for us, they can imagine what God can do in their hearts. They can imagine a bigger God, not just something they read that's lifeless, but something that's full of life. So don't miss the opportunity for us to reimagine what God can do through us. What brokenness he can restore through our congregation, through the people sitting here right now, so that a generation can see God in a new way, a fresh way. And that's what we want for this church. We want to work together so that the next generation can see God. And I want you to leave here thinking this morning, what part can I play? What piece am I in the puzzle? What part of the body am I in this thing? And if you've been sitting on your sidelines watching, now's the time to get in the game. Let me pray for us. Lord, thank you for our time together this morning. Thank you for Nehemiah.